Our subject tonight is Doña Gracia Mendez. This is really a fascinating story, and in a way, our adventure has been this year the Spanish diaspora, Gerush Sfarad, and this fascinating, creative, um, energetic, impactful group of people. And this story maybe doesn't quite have the um, intellectual importance of, let's say, the Arizal of, and his contributions. Maybe Danya Gracia Mendez doesn't necessarily stand next to Rabbi Yosef Karo in terms of the lasting impact on Jewish life and letters. But uh, her story is so important for a number of other reasons. Leaving any feminist aspect of this aside, her story is really, really instructive in terms of what life was like for Anusim, for Moranos Conversos, specifically the Portuguese variety. But you get a very strong idea of who these individuals, what they went through, and how they preserved their Judaism through this story. Add to that a couple of other very important things. Number one, she is a business and leadership genius and deserves to be understood and studied on that basis as well. I'm going to add to that even one more layer, and that is, in many ways, she was almost forgotten to history, and many of the things about her have to be constructed from the archives of other people. Many ways, because she was a woman, she just wasn't considered that important. And so it wasn't part of what was historically treasured back in her day, go back 500 years or so. But nowadays, I think we see her as a very rich and important figure. So let's get into her a little bit. Okay, sources. There really aren't a ton of sources on her. Heinrich Gretz, sort of the classic history of the Jews, certainly it has several pages on her, and so kol hakavod to Gretz for starting this off. Cecil Roth, who is a tremendous scholar of this period, has a sort of a small monograph on her, about maybe 120 pages. But there's a woman who wrote a book. She's really a journalist, and she really was dogged in terms of chasing down lots of information. Her name is Andre Elon Brooks, and really fascinating work that she did on this subject. So pretty much everything that I have comes from these three sources. Here we go. We're going to start with a little bit of background. You need to understand a little bit of background to the scenario of the Portuguese Anusim, these Portuguese Moranos. And so really, the Jews leave Spain, as people generally know, in 1492. They leave Spain. And they go to, many of them go to Portugal. Portugal's more or less a safe country for the next several years. But what happens is there is a shidduch that is proposed between Manuel I of Portugal and Maria of Aragon. Maria of Aragon is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. This is a very powerful shidduch. He wants the shidduch, but they are not willing to bless this marriage unless Portugal adopts a similar kind of purity to Spain, that she should only be the regent of a pure country. And how do you get a pure country? Well, you've got to get rid of your infidels. Your infidels are your Jews and your Muslims. But you see, Portugal has a slightly, maybe more advanced view of things. And when I say slightly, I mean very slightly. They understand that if you kick all of your Jews out, Jews are a very profitable part of your economy. And so if you're going to kick all of them out, you're going to cripple your economy. And so what they decide to do is they decide on a forced conversion of all the Jews. Now, and there's a certain realization that this isn't really going to work so well. And so how do they manage that? The way in which they manage that is they decide to baptize the children ages 4 to 14 first. And if your child is going to get baptized, then your child is going to be taken away and is going to be placed in the house of catechumens or some similar kind of a thing, some adoptive scenario, and you're going to lose your children. So most of the parents are going to say, okay, you know what? I can fake a baptism too. And so they all do this, and they adopt this scenario. Now, there's also another special thing about this conversion, this mass conversion, is that the Jews of Portugal make the following argument. They make the argument that, well, you can't burn all of our Jewish books because for two reasons. One argument was, and these are sort of conflicting arguments, but they're both arguments. One argument is, well, they're all medical books. The Jews are doctors, and their medical books are written in Hebrew. Now, you and I both know that not all of these books were actually, the Talmud Bavli might have a few medical suggestions, but it's not a medical book. Nobody misfiles the Talmud under anatomy and physiology, right? Maimonides has a little bit, yeah, sure, but again, nobody misfiles the Rambam's code, under pharmacology. So that's just not what happened. The other thing is they said, look, you can't expect them to uproot their Judaism overnight. We'll do it slowly, but let them at least keep their books. This is, by the way, a couple of years ago. A university in Porto discovered that its oldest and rarest artifact was a handwritten Bible from the 15th century. And here you see the archivist or the librarian handling that book. So, here, in a way, the Jewish books, they live on for a long time. And I'm really glad that nobody took that to the Geniza and says, oh, we don't read this anymore. This is a shout out to all of you who are delivering books to us, that maybe that's not the way we want to go with our Jewish books. But anyway, the Portuguese Jews, they retain a lot of their books, and they retain a lot of Judaism. There is also not an Inquisition just yet in Portugal. So 1497, we will encounter the Inquisition, but it has not come just yet. Okay, now. This is an important slide, and this is going to remain a little bit of an important piece of the picture. The Dona Gracia Mendes is descended from the Benvenisti family. To this day, you will find that there are many Sephardim named Benveniste. This is a very, very popular Spanish Sephardic name for the Sephardim Toharim. The Benvenistes were all very, very accomplished people. The great initiator was Rabbi Isaac Benveniste. Alfonso Benveniste was a city councilor in Castile. Avram Benveniste was the finance minister of Aragon. This is Rabbi Avram Benveniste, right? Just like the Barbanel is a finance minister and a rabbi, right? People of letters often find ways to be people of great influence. And now you'll see that Beatriz da Luna is the original name of Dona Gracia Mendes. So here you see Beatriz is married to Francisco. She married her uncle. Her sister, Brianda, married another uncle, Diogo. This was not uncommon amongst the Anusim. The Anusim had somehow in their minds that things were going to get better. They were going to cast off the yoke of the oppression of the Inquisition, of this oppression of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Reconquista, the Crusades, however you want to describe it. I think they had a sense that they were going to get out of this, and they did not want to mix in with Christians. They wanted to marry with Jews. There is probably another strain of this as well that people sometimes suggest, is that they knew that if you're marrying within the family, the Rothschilds do something like this too, that you help to preserve the fortune. And so that was not an unimportant factor here. But you can see that she is married to her uncle, who's considerably older than she is. And he's going to pass away 32 years before she does. We'll get to that shortly. But the important thing to take away from this slide is she has married her uncle, and this is part of the condition of the Portuguese Anusim Moranos, that they married within the family to preserve their Judaism to a large extent. Now, what I love about this is Diogo's Hebrew name was Meir, and Francisco's Hebrew name was Simcha. All right, this is just a little bit more of the family tree, just so you can, again, sort of see how it goes down. But you can see, again, that Beatrice is married to her uncle Francisco. Her sister Brianda is married to Diogo. Now, what's happening at this period of time, right? We're talking about the turn of the 16th century. Very important event is Vasco da Gama, who is a Portuguese explorer, successfully travels round trip to India by sea. And he returns to Portugal in September 1499, which essentially begins the Portuguese spice trade, which is going to be very, very lucrative for them, and it's going to be very lucrative for the Mendes family. Where the Mendes family started to make its money was this: when you are starting to trade over long distances, you do not want to have to transport bullion over the water, right? That is just a really bad idea, because you don't need a distribution network for bullion. If you're gonna capture a boatload of cinnamon, sometimes it might be hard to unload it. But bullion is a particularly how should I put it, liquid commodity, and it was heavy. And what happens is there are groups of people who learn how to use these letters of exchange. Letters of exchange essentially mean that, and the Mendes family business was principally between Antwerp and Portugal. And so they would be able to write bills of exchange that would go between these two centers, Antwerp being the distribution center for spices across Europe, and they started to have centers throughout Europe servicing France, Germany, etc. And they would make a healthy commission on these exchanges. But today's terms, those would be considered almost, usurious or highway robbery. But it was clearly worth it to people not to have to take gold and put it onto a ship. And so that's how they made their money. This, by the way, is a similar kind of a letter. It's a letter from Simão Rodrigues de Evora of Antwerp to Simon and Cosme Ruiz, who happens to be in Spain. Okay, and spices become a particularly lucrative commodity. This is a sort of a Roman cookbook of sorts that shows roughly of the period how interested people were in spices. They, of course, got these spices in 1487 over the Silk Road, the land route. But that's a much more expensive way than to sail a ship from India around the Cape of Africa, Horn of Africa, and up to Portugal. And so now we are making money literally hand over fist. The Mendes family is exceedingly wealthy. But then calamity strikes. Okay, and that's my little rest in peace. Francisco dies, and the crown tries to take her wealth, because remember, he's married to Dona Gracia Nasi. He's married to Beatriz de Luna, that's her other name. And there's sort of an interesting thing sort of happens, which is that she's appointed as the executor of the will, or of the estate. And also she's been involved in running the business. She knows what's going on. And so Francisco leaves everything to her. The crown says, ho, 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 wait a minute. This is, of course, the crown was looking out for the best interests of their daughter, Anna. And he proposes that Anna be brought up in the house of the queen, where an honorable person will marry her. This is a great way for the king to say, okay, well, I have a cousin, I have a son, I have somebody who is going, I'll propose the marriage, and then there'll be a kickback, right? So these are all ways that ancient monarchs try to get their hands on the money of their rich patrons. And he also refuses Donya to be the executor against because her decisions may be prejudicial against this orphan girl. And additionally, and this is sort of maybe a sad and tragic part of the story, is Doña Grazia could not remarry or have other children because the moment she would remarry, by the laws of the time, her husband would become the sole controller of all of her assets. And um, I guess there were either no more relatives to marry, or or she didn't trust anybody enough. But essentially, in order to preserve her wealth, she did not remarry. Now, there's another thing to know about King John the Pious. It was understood at the time that he was plotting to reintroduce the Inquisition. Now, this is a particularly bitter kind of a pill. Maybe he introduced it because he is, as his name would suggest, the pious, but really there's a much more naked, nefarious, and obvious reason to introduce the Inquisition. See, if you introduce the Inquisition, you have all of these wealthy Jewish Marranos who are good at trading because they got cousins and schmuzzins and they've got contacts in all sorts of other places, even places that the Christians and the Portuguese don't have networks like Istanbul and Morocco and Algeria. And these are a very wealthy class of people. And one of the ways you can get your hands on their money is by denouncing them to the Inquisition. Interestingly, I think it is true that the Inquisition disproportionately got the names of wealthy Marranos. Poor Marranos were relatively safe from the Inquisition because there wasn't really that much to get out of the accusation. But the Inquisition was able to reap the benefits of that. And it could very often be that if you had a debt to a wealthy Marrano, or you had some kind of business dealing, or they were a competitor, that it would be very advantageous for you to denounce them as somebody who light candles on Friday nights, that kind of thing, or they don't eat pork. It was not a good time to become a vegetarian. So King John III, the Pious in Portugal, is introducing the Inquisition because it's part of his money grab. And the rulers of Europe were always starved for cash. Okay, here we go. Now, May 23rd, 1536, the Inquisition comes to Portugal. Something interesting I learned from Andrea on this subject, the woman who wrote the book, The Woman Who Defied Kings, is that Christian law prevented a Christian from shedding the blood of another Christian, which is why they had to dislocate your joints, and they would use all sorts of different creative. They'd bend you over a wheel, they waterboard you, because all of those things don't draw blood. So they had to find methods of torture that weren't drawing blood. It's sort of the irony of it is almost too much to bear. You should also appreciate at this particular time, the Jews were trying to bribe the Pope not to introduce the Inquisition. And you should appreciate this is around the time that Martin Luther taxes 95 theses to the door of the church. And the chief complaint of Luther is that there's these things called indulgences, which is when the church allows you to get away with a sin for a particular bribe. Well, the Inquisition became a question of, well, who's going to give me more? Is King John going to give me more because he's going to make money off of the Jews? Or are the wealthy Jews going to be able to bribe the Pope enough in order to stave off the Inquisition? And ultimately, the Inquisition won. Okay, now, because the Mendes family was very well connected in all sorts of different ways, and because they were also lending money, they had money they had outstanding loans to Henry VIII. And so Henry VIII's agents and various ministers were able to send various kinds of letters. You weren't necessarily allowed to leave Portugal. Let's say you wanted to leave Portugal and go to Istanbul. Well, that was impossible. There's no such thing. First of all, Portuguese ships didn't really go to Istanbul. Secondly, because they were at war with each other. Secondly, they were always afraid that these people were leaving and they're going to take their wealth with them. The only way you were really allowed to travel was for business. Well, if you have an outstanding loan to the King of England, well, if you need to go collect it and you need to appear in person to go do that, that's a reason to get on a ship. And so their agents in cooperation with various members, and we even have some of the letters. This is one of those types of the type of work that give me one second. My memory is unfortunately not perfect. Andrea Brooks digs up is that she finds these letters in the archives of Henry VIII, of the specific letter that is the cover story for the boat from Lisbon to somewhere in the UK. I picked Cardiff, but that I couldn't say that it wasn't London. In either event, she ends up with her uncle and brother-in-law Diogo, and they end up in Antwerp. I had AI generate this based on a Portuguese carack, and what apparently they did was the homes in Portugal had all these false doors. The Moranos for many years had all this sort of secret life going on. They developed a very, very underground kind of mentality. And so there were internal doors between homes, and you could go into one home and sneak through one and come out, around the block in a different place entirely. And so they would sneak people out, and they would load. Let's say the ship was I couldn't get the AI to do this, but the ship was against the quay. Then they would bring a rowboat to the other side, and you would load on the opposite side of the boat, and that's how they would get you out, because they would do it at night when no one could see, and the this very surreptitious way of leaving. And the Dona Gracia and her I guess now brother-in-law, Uncle Diogo, are running really an underground railroad. And you would get out of Portugal in the way that we just described. You would come up to the opposite side of the boat. You would get in the boat. You would then go sail into Antwerp. And from Antwerp, you would then take an overland route through the Alps, probably through the Goddard Pass, into Milan. And from Milan, you would go to Venice, and Venice was a very good place to go because Venice was like Switzerland. You could do whatever you want. There's really only one law there, and that was making money, and they traded regularly with the Ottoman Empire. The other thing that the Mendes family was able to do through these bills of exchange is it was hard to get your property out of Portugal. It was hard to get your inventory out of Portugal, but you could get a bill of exchange out of Portugal. And so they would provide bills of exchange for, let's say, a Portuguese family that was maybe afraid of the Inquisition, and they would get out, they would go to Antwerp, and by the time they got to Venice, they were able to pick up or use this bill of exchange to, probably on some fractions of the dollar, but still, you live in freedom and you can make money with the riches that you have taken out with you. I was just very curious, by the way, because to me, going through the Alps, I guess I'm colored by the experience I had, 15 years ago when we took our trip through, from Vancouver to Drumheller, right, and going through the Rockies. So and they tell you can't go through Rogers Pass in the winter, and how do these things work? So I'm always sort of curious as how people get through these mountain passes. And so this is one of those mountain passes. This is this is not Goddard Pass, but another one which is somewhat similar. Obviously now there's a proper road here. There's a Mont Blanc tunnel too to get you through the Alps, but This is um, this is just gives you a sense of what it might have looked like um, as as these anusim, and ultimately we'll find out that Dona Gracia Mendes had to take this path herself. So this is what their route looked like. Um, This is a contemporary account. Samuel Uske, 1553. He writes this book, which is about consolation of the tribulations of Israel. Obviously, it's written here in Portuguese. And this is what he writes. Has anyone ever seen a woman of such true-hearted courage? Her inspiration greatly encouraged your needy children in Portugal who were too poor and weak to undertake a lengthy journey. She generously provided money and other needs to the refugees who arrived destitute, seasick in Flanders. She helped them overcome the rigors of the craggy Alps in Germany. She provisioned the rich by cashing bills of exchange at a time when they could not use their wealth. She sent boats loaded with bread and provisions and revived the starving people. Thus, with her golden hand and angelic purpose, she lifted the majority from the abyss and continued to guide them until they were safe in safe lands. Has anyone ever seen a woman of such true-hearted oh, sorry, actually got pasted twice. Forgive me for that. This is obviously a very inspirational quote. Sort of shows you, what she really was doing. Now, unfortunately, we know that her husband died, and that's 1535. And then 7 years later, I believe, or 8 years later, her brother-in-law Diogo dies, and the crown tries to take her wealth again. And Dona Garcia becomes the executor of the estate and of the business. Now, apparently, Brianda was a bit of a party animal, and Diogo does not trust her at all to look after their daughter, and does not trust her at all to look after the family business, because all she's interested in doing is drinking and partying, etc. This creates a big problem because ultimately her sister will eventually denounce her to the Inquisition, which she quickly is able to neutralize. But you can see there's a very difficult sort of situation, and she must have had, ice to a certain extent running through her veins, because it's always very hard to sort of suffer the attacks of family members. But she was clearly recognized by everyone else in the family as the most capable person. She had already been involved in the business. She had already been running the business. And so Francisco is not prepared to leave his niece and wife, who is a bit of a dilettante, to take this over. Now, the family is now in Antwerp. She has escaped Portugal, and Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor. But at this period in history, the Habsburgs did not have a standing army, and they would hire various mercenaries. And the thing about mercenaries is, if you don't pay them, they stop fighting for you, and they go shopping for someone else who's going to pay them. And so the emperor was always very hungry for cash, and to be able to stave off, or to feed this mercenary machine. And so, as before, how do you grab the wealth of the Mendes Nassif family? Well, you present you try to present various shidduchim that will allow you to get your hands on their money. And so the Charles V is going to speak to his sister, the Queen Marie, the regent of the lowlands, and the Dowager Queen, and she says to him, "The merchants will take it as a poor precedent and remove to a place beyond your lands, where they are not in the habit of forcing marriages, and this might give rise to murmuring on the part of your subjects and lead to the removal of the girl along with her wealth." In other words, you're going to have to play this carefully, my brother. It's not going to be so easy. And ultimately, Dona Gracia de Mendes, she knows what the queen is coming to speak to her about, and she says she's sick, and she She says she can't take an audience. Ultimately, they have a face-to-face audience, and she is tough as nails. Apparently, she says the following: I'd rather see Anna drown than marry such a disreputable nobleman. And then separately, apparently to the rabbi, she said, the seed of the great and holy will not be mixed with that of Christendom. Now, there different historians read this differently. It could be her pure Jewish pride. It could be that, she knew that she was this was a family of great wealth, and she wasn't about to mix with just any money-grubbing nobleman who's going to give a kickback to the crown. Actually, let me just go back. So based on this, she knows she has to get out of Antwerp. She knows that this is not going to be a good situation. And so essentially she ends up going through that overland route, and she's even robbed. There's the chest of pearls that are taken from her as she leaves. There is also wealth that she's simply just unable to get out of Antwerp, but she does manage to take a significant portion of her wealth with her. And they had, like many people, she created, a multi-pronged strategy so that she had assets in other places that couldn't be easily seized by the emperor. Now, she, maybe I'm a little ahead of myself. She ends up in Venice, and she has, and it is in Venice where she is denounced by her sister to the Inquisition. What is very interesting about Dona Gracia, and I'm not going to go over again. Last week, I'll just mention, last week we did the whole episode of Ancona. Ancona is when the Pope is going to reintroduce the Inquisition for the Portuguese Moranos. Remember, the Portuguese Moranos had been told by previous popes that he wasn't going to treat them as Christians, he was going to treat them as Jews because they had been forcibly converted. And she's very involved in attempting to gain the rescue of the Portuguese Moranos. But one of the things which is very interesting about Dona Gracia is when she enters Istanbul, she enters Istanbul with like 60 horsemen and like 3 carriages. She makes a splash. And Jews in Istanbul are not allowed to dress like this. This is not typical dress. She's wearing her very fine Venetian gowns. And she had a special letter that was written for her so that she could dress this way. And she made, an appearance, a very significant appearance. In Istanbul, once she finally gets to Istanbul, and ultimately Jews wanted to get to those kinds of places because they wanted to become full-fledged Jews. They wanted to stop pretending. They knew that the Inquisition was always around the corner, and they didn't want to have to pretend. They didn't want to have to behave in ways that were beneath them. There is some conflict that they do have with various parts of the rabbinic world who the rabbinic response with respect to the Anusim, to the Moranos, was varied. I would say by and large they were embraced, but there's certainly pieces of this. There were from time to time you find a tshuva which says that, well, maybe you guys should have left earlier, you were just staying because of the wealth. There are all sorts of things that if you were someone who went through this ordeal, you might find as a very, very painful thing. And so, like in Amsterdam and other places, the Anusim, the Sephardim Tohorim, the pure Sephardic Jews, they set up their own synagogues. So this is the Signora Geveret synagogue. She was known in Istanbul as La Signora, the lady. Some people say that sort of almost said almost as if she was the savior. She was incredibly generous. She, of course, set up her own synagogue. She also brought in her own rabbis, kept a yeshiva, and we have ledgers that say that they fed her accountant said he was amazed that they fed 80 people per day, and she gave thousands of ducats to the poor for a hospital and various kinds of things like that. So her sense of tzedakah was enormous. And now she also is a proto-Zionist of the first order. And uh, Andrea Elon Brooks has um, her analysis is that Doña Gracia's nephew, Joseph, was often credited with the Tiberian experience. I'll get to what the Tiberian experience is in a minute. She claims that really Doña Gracia Mendes was the force behind it, but in the Ottoman world, you needed to um, uh, let the men do the talking to a certain extent. But maybe before I even get into Tveria, let me just talk a little bit about Doña Gracia and her relationship with the Sultan. She's obviously a very wealthy woman. She knows how to dress. She knows how to make a splash. And she gets an audience with the Sultan. The audience with the Sultan allows her to push for the Jews of Ancona and say, you have Turkish citizens there. You need to go argue with the Pope and tell him, as we saw last week, that he would do well to let the Turkish citizens out of his prisons because he's got no jurisdiction over them, which in fact he did. And so we'll see when we come to the summary, this is one of her geniuses, to let powerful people do your bidding for you. And of course, part of the argument was, these guys are taxpayers. If you let them languish in the prison in Ancona, you're not going to get the money that is owed you. And these were the kinds of tactics she used. She said, "Oh, you want your royalties payment? Well, I can't do my royalties payment because my agents are trapped in a prison in Ancona, and in order for me to get paid and for me to pay you, I'm going to need you to release these people." Those were the kinds of conversations she had. She was very businesslike about a lot of those things. What's the Tiberius Project? What Doña Gracia Mendes realized is that she had lived now in Portugal, Antwerp, crossed the Alps. She'd been robbed crossing the Alps, and then lived in Istanbul, where maybe she lived free, but there were laws against dhimmis and various rules that are meant to subordinate Jews to Muslims. And she was obligated she saw exactly how that worked. And she said, you know what, we Jews, we need a place where we can be free, where we can run our own lives. And so she chose Tveria, and she basically made an economic argument to the Sultan. The economic argument was, look, this is what the tax revenues are going to be there. I will prepay the tax revenues and let me run the city. And she thought that the Jews would flock to her. But, it's a lot like Israel in 1948, maybe Israel in 1967. The Jews are saying, I'm not sure. I've got a house and 2 cars in suburbia. I've got a good job, and I really like the JCC. So, I'm Jewish enough. I don't need to go to Israel, even though maybe my parents were Holocaust survivors, and maybe it would have been great if we had Israel. But it's a very interesting thing. The Jews from wealthy places, by and large, did not emigrate to Israel. And there are a couple different things which really helped the birth of the state of Israel. Number one is the United States started closing off its immigration doors to Eastern European Jews. And another thing is that Jews used to have refugee status from the Soviet Union to get into the United States. I think it was Yitzhak Shamir. Shamir went to George Bush and said, those Jews from the Soviet Union can go to Israel. You don't need to give them refugee status here in America. And that's how you got 1 million Russian Jews in Israel. It was a very, very big deal. So wealthy Jews tend not to go to Israel for the pure promise of Zionism. And in many ways now, Israel's very attractive because Israel's economy is growing faster, certainly than Canada's, and maybe in certain ways in the United States. So people didn't really respond to this initiation of Zionism in the way that they didn't respond to this Zionism in the way that we would have hoped or dreamed, but she was so far ahead of her time. She wanted to create a refuge for Anusim. She wanted to create a refuge for those Marranos who had suffered so terribly, who could really be Jewish and amongst themselves. Let me just go back just 1 second about this Marrano community. They had Judaism, but didn't have Judaism. They had sort of a funny blend of it. It had been for some, we're talking here when this project starts in 1558, it has already been 60 years that many of these Jews had lived as secret Christians. So if you think about it, and people live to 40 years old, we're already in the second, maybe third generation of people who they're the grandchildren of the people who knew what authentic Judaism was. Now, Portuguese scenario was maybe better than the Spanish one because they didn't have the Inquisition for, going in 30, 40 years into the project. They also, they were able to keep some books. Maybe there was more substance to the Portuguese condition than the Spanish condition, but there was a lot of Torah that disappeared. Very often they brought rabbis from Venice or other places to help them revive their Judaism. As I mentioned before, the symbol of the Amsterdam Jewish community is the phoenix, because they knew that they were born out of the ashes and they knew they had to sort of reconstitute their Judaism. And so there is an element of this which is remarkable in that they really did, to a certain extent, reboot, revive, and reintegrate to the Jewish community. And we see, right, that, again, last week, we saw that the Rabbi Levi Ibn Chaviv, rather, was of this Portuguese extraction. He became one of the most important rabbis in the world, certainly the most important rabbi in Jerusalem at that time. We know that many of these other families came out of Spain and Portugal, and so Shlomo Alkabetz, Yosef Karo, all are coming from this tradition, all are reintegrating, but to think that there's no need for a reboot here, that there's no need for a revival of sort of the internal bones of their Judaism is perhaps a little bit, it's hard for us to see, but important for us to understand at the same time. Now, Andrea Elon Brooks, she has an interesting summary of the things that she learned from Daniel Gracia Mendes. A lot of them are good business advice. A lot of them are good life advice. Avoid using your own money. Have a plan B and a plan C. Don't wait for plan A to fail before implementing plan B, which is nice if you have enough money to be able to spread your bets that way. One of the best ones, though, are low interest loans are better than bribes. In other words, you feel like a schnook if you're bribing a Christian official, but if you give them a loan and they have to pay it back, and then when they pay it back, you can tell them to get another loan on another condition. You can string people along and you can create a dependency that helps you get different things done. So I think that that's a very interesting insight there. Always have an exit strategy. When you get into a project, make sure you have an exit strategy. Never burn your bridges. Dress well and use powerful people to intercede for you. A really remarkable woman, a woman who, if you're just going to look at her from the Jewish history perspective, the Jewish model perspective, that in a way with a Torah lens, she's a person whose life was dedicated to rescuing a captive community. She took care of the poor. She fought battles on behalf of oppressed Jews, the Ancona story, and she was looking to rebuild the Jewish world in the land of Israel, in Tiberia. She really ticks so many boxes. I think also one of the things that makes me sort of passionate about this story of Jewish history is I think that it's important for us to sort of put ourselves inside these stories, to sort of see ourselves as the next chapter, as the inheritors of the baton that women like this passed on, and to conceive of ourselves in a fashion where people who did these kind of heroics are the people who should inspire us, and our stories should emulate them. Now, very often the stories are about the stories of Jewish history may be about martyrdom. They may be about uh, um, certain feats of scholarship, which for many of us seem just far beyond what we think we could do personally. What I love about the story of Doña Gracia Mendez is that she did all of her work from the boardroom. She is a boardroom hero. She saves the Jewish people from her position as someone who has a trade network, who has a financial network. That is how she flexes her muscle. That's how she gets things done. And there, a lot of us have, to greater and lesser extents, we have spheres of influence and we have things that we can do. But she, I think, is just a brilliant, brilliant example to us. And I'm glad that there has been a revival of trying to discover some of these figures. You should know, she's not the only one who was a great court Jew, so to speak. There are a number of others, contemporaries of hers, even the Oppenheim family, the Aguilar family. There are a number of them. Of course, the Rothschilds, the Montefiores. But the stories go well beyond just those particular individuals. And I think it's time for us to start to understand, venerate, and appreciate that they may as well be some of our shining lights in this concept of Jewish history. So with that, I'm going to we'll stop and